Welcome to AP European History with Mr. Bowby. Today we'll be talking about Section 6 of the McKay, Hill, and Buckler text, 7th edition, Politics and the State in the Renaissance. And this is the final section of Chapter 13, European Society in the Age of the Renaissance. In this brief lecture, we'll be taking a close look at the major power players in Northern Europe, France, England, and Spain. And we'll be taking a look at some of the similarities and some of the differences that they had in uniting and bringing power and prestige back to the throne after it had been weakened with events like the Hundred Years' War and the Plague. It's during this period of time that European countries begin to recover from all of the devastating effects of some pretty great events in European history that we discussed in Chapter 12. And they do this through attempting to centralize power. As your text discusses, even though these rulers come before Machiavelli writes The Prince, they tend to incorporate without knowing his ideas and his philosophies. These rulers have a lot of commonalities, including their ruthlessness, violence, and a heavy hand that they use to establish domestic order. From the nobility and the aristocracy who had come to find ways to gain power in loosely knit alliances during the chaos of the wars and the epidemics that had run through Europe. The examples that we'll be discussing: Louis XI of France, Henry VII of England, and Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They preferred to be secure and feared rather than to be loved. They used royal authority for a national purpose and for unification goals. And in doing so, people accepted taxes in exchange for a more even keel and stable order to their way of life. That had not been the case excuse me, during the previous centuries. Taking a look at France, the Hundred Years' War and the Plague had left France in a state of ruin. Charles VII, who rules from 1422 to 1461, reconciles regional differences and moves France towards recovery. And the way he does this is instituting taxes on salt and land that would fund the crown for centuries, actually up until revolution in the later 1700s. Another significant contribution of Charles is he creates the first permanent royal standing army in Europe. And this is significant, and it's a model that other European countries will use. Before this, there had not been professional armies per se. People were trained and paid when needed, and they were provided and supplied by the nobility. Another thing that Charles does is the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges in 1438. And this is a commonality that you'll see in all three of these countries, and really makes us understand the power of the papacy, of the Catholic Church, and how important it was, if they were going to consolidate power as monarchs, that they have some control over the church. Okay? The church's money, the church's power and influence over the people. And the Pragmatic Sanction asserts government power over the papacy and consolidates power. Louis XI further consolidates power through heavy taxation, showing his iron fist, and by strengthening industry. In England, they suffered considerably, and they did not suffer as much land devastation from the Hundred Years' War because a majority of that was fought in France, but approximately 25% of their population had been decimated by the plague. And that population decimation continued for 20 to 30 years after the plague. There was still a decline in population. The aristocracy dominated government, and they were incredibly indulgent, taking for granted all of the things that were important to keeping England a strong and unified nation. An example of this, one that may be familiar to some of you, is called the War of the Roses, and it was a civil war that exemplified the frustrations of the time between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. And it's called the War of the Roses because York's symbol was a white rose, Lancaster's symbol was a red rose. And this disorder continued to hurt trade, agriculture, and industry, further stagnating England after the Hundred Years' War and the Plague. It was a very low point in English history. Henry VI was the monarch at the time and had very little control. It's presumed that he was mentally ill, and there was no figurehead to provide stability and order. Edward IV comes along, and he is given credit for beginning to restore this order. Along with the succession of monarchs that will follow him, they reestablish a prestige to the throne. He's from York. He defeats Lancaster and ends this civil war and starts to move England forward finally after a couple of hundred years of great instability and economic downturn. One of the biggest problems in England, as the monarchs saw it from their point of view, was that Parliament financed the wars. And Parliament was controlled by the aristocracy, and therefore Parliament was very powerful. They kind of called the shots. And this is something that the monarchs knew was not going to cut it if they were going to regain control and ultimate authority in England. Henry VII is in a long line of diplomats. He is from the Tudor house, the Welsh house of Tudors, who eventually will give us Elizabeth I and quite a storied bloodline of monarchs in England. And he's a diplomat, and he and a couple of the previous monarchs mentioned in your text believe in diplomacy. And what this does is it saves the country a lot of money, and therefore they are not relying on Parliament to finance wars, and they are not relying on aristocracy, nobility to fund these wars, therefore pulling some of that power away. He calls on Parliament to confirm laws, but he tries to decrease the power of the nobility. And one way that he does this is a very prominent example in your text. And it's through what he calls the Court of Star Chamber. And the Star Chamber is so named because of all the stars that are painted on the ceiling. But what it basically does is it reverts to Roman law, or the principles of Roman law, which really terrifies the aristocrats. And it's a way to kind of quell and deal with the aristocracy and their crimes. Accused persons that weren't entitled to see evidence against them, sessions were secret. Torture could be one of the outcomes or punishments. And although this was against English common law, as he is regaining power, he's able to continue this Court of Star Chamber and really quell the aristocracy through fear. Final thoughts about England. As I mentioned before, the Tudors. Henry VII is one of the first in a long line of succession of the English monarchy that will be tied to the Tudors. They're Welsh royalty who are credited with restoring the prestige to the throne. And another big idea for them is that they won support of the upper middle class by promoting trade and industry and stability. Finally, the Kingdom of Spain. And what I have here is an illustration for you to show you Spain could be compared in some ways to northern Italy or even all of Italy in the fact that it was a conglomerate of independent kingdoms. And we'll get to how those kingdoms are unified. But if you'll notice, the Kingdom of Portugal, okay, which will eventually become Portugal, is just as it always would be. The two major kingdoms are the Kingdom of Aragon, and you'll hear Aragon quite a bit in the future, and Castile. in the middle, and one of the thorns in the Spanish side was the Kingdom of Granada. And here, this kingdom is in the south, and not surprisingly, it's Moorish, meaning that it was heavily Muslim at the time. And Spain happens to be, at this time in Europe, extremely diverse, and this did not fit with medieval principles. Diversity was not something that was cherished and celebrated. There are many Muslims, there are approximately 200,000 Jews. Um, you've got various different races and religions, and this allows for all of these independent kingdoms. For centuries, Spain had been attempting Reconquista, especially Aragon and Castile, and it was a long attempt by the Christian North to expel the Jews and the Muslims and to unite Spain. And this does not really gain a lot of traction until the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, this loosely unites Spain, but they take the final steps to kind of finish off this Reconquista, and they do it through various means. One of the first things they do, which is mentioned in your text, is they issue power to the Hermandades, okay, the local police force. Somewhat similar in creating fear. Although the fear of the Star Chamber was in the courts, the Hermandades are a local police force. They're given the power and the jurisdiction to enforce harsh justice and quell rebellion. They restructured their royal council and comprised, the royal council of the middle class. And this cut the aristocracy out of the loop, which was something that we find as a commonality in all three countries. Finally, Ferdinand and Isabella used the church in several ways to solidify their power. They allied with the papacy and in effect established a national church. And one of the important things here is they now had power over appointing all of the cardinals, all of the church officials, and they also had power to control the church's wealth. And this was significant to them in completing the Reconquista because this is where they gained the finances and the funds to eventually overtake Granada and unite Spain in essence. Although your text alludes to the fact that Spain was still somewhat loosely controlled, a conglomerate of kingdoms, it was now more united than it had ever been. And the final step was eliminating some of that diversity. Although many Jews stayed after the Reconquista and became what your text describes as new Christians or conversos, that were converted Jews, they were still distrusted and disliked. And this provided for another movement in history of anti-Semitism and distrust for the Jews, and what we know, or what you should be familiar with, as the Spanish Inquisition, or a reigniting of this Inquisition, which was a weeding out of people who were non-Christians. Ferdinand and Isabella were very cunning, as Machiavelli would approve, like a fox, in that they had the church lead the Inquisition, so that if it did not gain popularity among the public, they could always blame the church, or if the public did like it, they could step in and claim responsibility. So they tried to have it both ways. They were a brilliant ruling couple. The Spanish Inquisition unifies Spain and eventually expels the Jews through many cruel methods of torture and a lot of murder. Okay, there are 200,000 Jews in Spain prior to the Inquisition, and after the Inquisition, it's estimated that there are under 50,000 that are left. So you can see similarities and distinct differences in how England, Spain, and France conglomerated their power and restored prestige to the throne. And this will continue for the next couple of centuries in Northern Europe and in these countries.